We're watching the pieces move on the chessboard right now, and what's unfolding in the Middle East isn't just another news cycle, it's a potential inflection point that could reshape everything we thought we understood about American power projection and global stability. US naval warships are positioning near Israeli waters at this very moment, and Trump's administration is making announcements that have serious implications for whether we're about to witness a direct military confrontation between Washington and Tehran. But here's what the mainstream narrative won't tell you. This isn't about spontaneous aggression or sudden threats. This is the culmination of decades-long strategic positioning, broken treaties, economic sanctions that have strangled entire populations, and a carefully constructed pretext for conflict that serves very specific interests. The nuclear question isn't fear-mongering, it's a legitimate concern when you understand how quickly conventional warfare can escalate when great powers collide in regions they've both claimed as vital to their interests. What we need to examine isn't just what's happening today, but why this moment was inevitable, who benefits from the chaos, and what the real endgame looks like beyond the propaganda. Let me start by being absolutely clear about something that should concern every American watching this unfold. When you see US naval assets moving toward the eastern Mediterranean, when you hear the drumbeat of war rhetoric escalating from Washington, when intelligence agencies start leaking carefully curated information about imminent threats from Iran, you're not witnessing spontaneous developments, you're watching a script that was written years ago, and we're simply arriving at the scene where the conflict becomes unavoidable unless something fundamentally changes in how power operates in that region. The Trump administration's announcements regarding Iran aren't happening in a vacuum, and they're certainly not happening because Tehran suddenly decided to become more aggressive. What we're seeing is the logical progression of a policy framework that has been in place since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, a framework that has consistently sought to isolate, weaken, and ultimately subordinate Iran to Western geopolitical interests. Now, I want you to think about what's really at stake here, because it goes far beyond the immediate question of whether missiles will fly or whether we'll see military action in the coming days or weeks. What's at stake is the entire architecture of how global power has been structured since the end of World War II, and more specifically, how that architecture has been maintained through military dominance, dollar hegemony, and the control of strategic resources, particularly energy. Iran represents something that the architects of American foreign policy find absolutely intolerable, and it's not primarily about nuclear weapons, despite what you'll hear repeated endlessly in the media. Iran represents an independent power center in one of the most strategically vital regions on Earth, a nation that refused to remain within the sphere of Western influence after overthrowing a puppet regime that had been installed by Anglo-American intelligence services. That original sin, that refusal to remain subordinate, has marked Iran for regime change ever since, and every subsequent action, every sanction, every accusation, every military maneuver has been designed to bring about that outcome. The positioning of US naval forces near Israel right now is being presented as a defensive measure, as a deterrent against Iranian aggression, as protection for America's closest ally in the Middle East. But let's examine what deterrence really means in this context. Deterrence is supposed to prevent conflict by making the cost of aggression too high for a potential adversary. But when you position overwhelming military force on the doorstep of a nation you've been economically strangling for decades, when you've assassinated their military leaders, when you've conducted covert operations inside their territory, when you've armed and supported groups fighting proxy wars against them, when you've torn up diplomatic agreements that took years to negotiate, what you're actually doing isn't deterrence. What you're doing is creating the conditions where conflict becomes almost inevitable, where the pressured nation feels it has no choice but to respond to provocations, and where that response can then be characterized as unprovoked aggression, justifying the military action you wanted to take all along. The nuclear dimension of this crisis is particularly instructive if you're willing to look past the hysteria and examine the actual facts. Iran has been accused of pursuing nuclear weapons for decades now, and these accusations have been used to justify sanctions that have devastated the Iranian economy and caused immense suffering for ordinary Iranian citizens who have nothing to do with their government's policies. But here's what's fascinating about the nuclear issue when you actually dig into it. The International Atomic Energy Agency, despite enormous pressure from Western governments to find evidence of a weapons program, has consistently reported that while Iran has developed nuclear technology, there's no definitive evidence of an active weapons program. The 2015 nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was designed to address even the theoretical possibility of Iran developing nuclear weapons by imposing the most intrusive inspection regime ever created, giving international inspectors unprecedented access to Iranian facilities. And according to the IAEA, Iran was in compliance with that agreement. They were doing exactly what they promised to do. And then the Trump administration, in its first term, unilaterally withdrew from the agreement, reimposed sanctions, and began demanding concessions that went far beyond the nuclear issue, essentially proving to Iran and to the rest of the world that compliance means nothing, that agreements mean nothing, that the real goal was never about nuclear weapons at all. So what is the real goal? Well, you have to understand the broader strategic picture that shapes American policy in the Middle East, and it's a picture that hasn't fundamentally changed despite transitions between different administrations, despite rhetoric about ending forever wars, despite occasional tactical shifts. The United States has maintained since the Carter Doctrine of 1980 that it will use military force if necessary to ensure the free flow of oil from the Persian Gulf, and more broadly, to prevent any hostile power from dominating the region. That doctrine has been the foundation for decades of military intervention, for the permanent stationing of US forces across the Gulf states, for the network of bases and alliances that give Washington enormous leverage over global energy markets. Iran, because of its geography, because of its substantial oil and gas reserves, because of its influence over the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of global oil supply passes, because of its relationships with non-state actors across the region, has the potential to disrupt this entire arrangement. An independent, powerful Iran that charts its own course represents a fundamental challenge to the regional order that Washington has worked so hard to construct and maintain. And this is where Israel enters the picture in a way that Americans need to understand more clearly. The relationship between the United States and Israel is often characterized as one where America supports Israel out of shared values, shared democratic principles, strategic friendship, and certainly there are elements of that in the relationship. But there's also a harder, more strategic dimension that gets less attention in public discourse. Israel serves as a projection of American power in the Middle East, as an unsinkable aircraft carrier in a region where popular sentiment is often hostile to US interests, as a military force capable of actions that would be politically difficult for the United States to undertake directly. The Israeli government, particularly under Netanyahu and the coalition that has held power recently, has been absolutely obsessed with the Iranian threat, seeing Iran as an existential danger to Israeli security. And Israeli intelligence and political leaders have been among the most vocal advocates for aggressive action against Iran, including military strikes against nuclear facilities. When US naval forces position themselves near Israel in moments of heightened tension with Iran, they're not just protecting Israel from external threats, they're integrating themselves into a potential military action that Israel might initiate, creating a situation where American forces would almost inevitably be drawn into any conflict that erupts. The timing of the current escalation is also worth examining carefully. We're in a moment of enormous global flux, where the post-Cold War unipolar order, dominated by the United States, is clearly giving way to something more multipolar, where rising powers like China and resurgent powers like Russia are challenging American primacy, where the dollar's role as the global reserve currency is facing unprecedented pressure, where American military interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria have produced such catastrophic results that public appetite for new wars has diminished significantly. In this context, the push for confrontation with Iran starts to look like an attempt to reassert American dominance, to demonstrate that despite these setbacks, despite the rise of peer competitors, the United States still has the will and the capacity to impose its preferences through military force. It's a demonstration of power at a moment when that power is increasingly being questioned. But it's also incredibly dangerous precisely because it's driven by this defensive psychology, this sense that American hegemony is slipping and must be violently reasserted before it's too late. The economic dimensions of potential conflict with Iran are staggering and rarely discussed with the seriousness they deserve. A major military confrontation in the Persian Gulf region would send oil prices skyrocketing, potentially triggering a global recession. The disruption to maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz alone would affect not just oil shipments, but all kinds of trade flowing between Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Insurance rates for shipping would become prohibitive. Global supply chains that are already fragile after years of pandemic disruption and geopolitical tensions would face new breaking points, and that's just the immediate economic impact. The longer-term consequences of a US-Iran war would include further de-dollarization as countries seek to insulate themselves from an international system weaponized through sanctions, further fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs, and potentially the complete breakdown of whatever remained of the post-World War II international order. Who benefits from this? Certainly not ordinary Americans who would face higher prices, economic disruption, and potentially another generation of young people sent to fight in a Middle Eastern conflict. Certainly not ordinary Iranians who have already suffered enormously under sanctions and would face devastation in any war. The benefits accrue to a much narrower set of interests: defense contractors who profit from war, oil producers who benefit from supply disruptions and higher prices, political leaders who use external threats to consolidate domestic power, and geopolitical strategists who see the world as a chessboard where human suffering is just the cost of maintaining dominance. I want to talk about the nuclear escalation risk because this is where the current crisis enters truly terrifying territory. Iran doesn't currently possess nuclear weapons, but if they were attacked by the United States or Israel, if they faced an existential threat to their regime and their nation, the calculus around developing nuclear weapons would change instantly. A nation under existential threat will pursue any means of survival, and nuclear weapons represent the ultimate deterrent against regime change, as North Korea has demonstrated. So military action against Iran, rather than preventing nuclear proliferation, could actually guarantee it, pushing Iran to pursue weapons development with maximum urgency and with nothing left to lose. Moreover, the broader nuclear dimension involves the risk that conflict in the Middle East could draw in other nuclear powers. Russia has relationships with Iran and would view American military action as further encroachment on regions Moscow considers within its sphere of influence. The risk of miscalculation, of unintended escalation, of a regional conflict spiraling into something much larger is very real, and it's being driven by people who seem to have learned nothing from the catastrophic miscalculations that led to previous wars. The propaganda campaign that precedes military action follows a predictable pattern, and we're seeing all the familiar elements right now. Intelligence agencies leak information about imminent threats, about weapons programs, about terrorist plots being planned. Media outlets amplify these claims without subjecting them to critical scrutiny, having learned nothing from the Iraq War and the fabricated intelligence about weapons of mass destruction that was used to justify that catastrophe. Political leaders speak in grave tones about the necessity of action, about how all options are on the table, about how diplomatic efforts have been exhausted even when those diplomatic efforts were sabotaged by the very people now claiming they failed. Expert commentators appear on television to explain why war is regrettable but necessary, why the risks of inaction exceed the risks of action, why this time will be different from all the previous disasters. And public opinion is carefully managed through this drumbeat of alarming information, through the creation of a psychological environment where war seems inevitable and even reasonable, where questioning the march toward conflict is characterized as naive or even treasonous. But we should question it. We should demand actual evidence for the claims being made. We should ask who benefits from conflict and who pays the price. We should examine the track record of the people advocating for military action and ask whether they've been right about anything in the past. We should consider whether there are alternative approaches that haven't been genuinely explored because they don't serve the interests of those who profit from conflict. The reality is that diplomacy with Iran is possible, that mutual coexistence is achievable, that the United States and Iran have no fundamental reason to be enemies other than the geopolitical frameworks and ideological commitments that powerful interests have chosen to maintain. Iran is not an irrational actor. Iranian leaders, however much you may disagree with their ideology or their domestic policies, operate according to comprehensible strategic logic. They want security for their regime, they want economic development for their country, they want respect as a regional power. These are goals that could be accommodated within a different framework of regional relations, within an approach based on spheres of influence and mutual non-interference rather than absolute dominance and subordination. The human cost of war with Iran would be catastrophic, and I mean that in the most literal sense. We're talking about a nation of 85 million people, a country with significant military capabilities, a geography that makes invasion and occupation virtually impossible, a population that would likely rally around their government despite any domestic grievances once they were under attack. The casualties would be measured in hundreds of thousands, potentially millions. The refugee crisis would dwarf anything we've seen from Syria or Afghanistan. The use of advanced weapon systems against urban areas, against infrastructure, against military targets located near civilian populations would create humanitarian disasters on a scale that should make anyone with a conscience recoil. And unlike Iraq, which was weakened by decades of sanctions and isolation, Iran has the capacity to strike back, to target U.S. forces throughout the region, to launch missiles at neighboring countries hosting American bases, to activate proxy forces that could open new fronts across the Middle East. This wouldn't be a clean, quick operation. It would be a protracted, devastating conflict with consequences that would ripple across the world for decades. What's particularly tragic about the current trajectory is that it's not inevitable. It's chosen. At every point in this escalating crisis, there have been off-ramps, opportunities for de-escalation, chances to step back from the brink. Those opportunities have been consistently rejected in favor of maximum pressure, in favor of confrontation, in favor of policies designed to make conflict more rather than less likely. And the American people, who would ultimately pay the price for this conflict in blood and treasure, have had almost no say in this process. Foreign policy has been captured by a narrow set of interests and ideologies that operate with minimal democratic oversight, that pursue objectives the public doesn't support and often doesn't even understand, that commit the nation to conflicts that serve elite interests rather than genuine national security. This is the reality of how empire operates, how decisions about war and peace are made by people insulated from the consequences of those decisions, people who will never fight in the wars they start, people whose children will never be sent to die in desert battlefields, people who profit financially and politically from the very disasters they create. So, as we watch US warships move toward the Middle East, as we hear Trump administration officials make their announcements about Iran, as we see the media machinery gearing up to sell another war, we need to recognize what's actually happening. This isn't about protecting America from imminent threats. This isn't about preventing nuclear proliferation or fighting terrorism or defending democracy or any of the other noble-sounding justifications that will be offered. This is about power, about dominance, about the determination of a declining empire to maintain its position through military force, even as that approach becomes increasingly costly and counterproductive. This is about interests that benefit from conflict and chaos, that profit from instability and war. And unless enough people recognize what's being done in their name and demand a different approach, unless there's genuine resistance to this march toward catastrophe, we're going to witness another disastrous war that will make the world more dangerous, more chaotic, and more hostile to American interests than it was before. The question isn't whether Iran poses challenges, or whether the Middle East is complicated, or whether there are real conflicts of interest at play. The question is whether military confrontation is the appropriate response to those challenges, and the answer, based on everything we've learned from decades of failed interventions, should be absolutely clear. But that answer requires us to break free from the propaganda, to think critically about whose interests are being served, and to demand accountability from leaders who are so cavalier about risking global catastrophe for the sake of maintaining an unsustainable imperial project.